Section 80 of Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, translated by Helen Tracy Lowe Porter. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Bruce Peary. Part 8, Chapter 8b. Now the Frau Consul rose. She grasped the hands of her grandson Johann and her granddaughter Elisabeth and proceeded through the room. The elders of the family fell in behind, and the younger brought up the rear. The servants and poor joined in from the hall, and so they marched, singing with one accord, "O Evergreen." Uncle Christian sang "O Ever Blue," and made the children laugh by lifting up his legs like a jumping jack, through the wide-open lofty folding doors and straight into paradise. The whole great room was filled with the fragrance of slightly singed evergreen twigs and glowing with light from countless tiny flames. The sky-blue hangings with the white figures on them added to the brilliance. There stood the mighty tree, between the dark red window curtains, towering nearly to the ceiling, decorated with silver tinsel and large white lilies, with a shining angel at the top and the manger at the foot. Its candles twinkled in the general flood of light like far-off stars. And a row of tiny trees, also full of stars and hung with comfits, stood on the long white table, laden with presents, that stretched from the window to the door. All the gas brackets on the wall were lighted too, and thick candles burned in all four of the gilded candelabra in the corners of the room. Large objects, too large to stand upon the table, were arranged upon the floor, and two smaller tables, likewise adorned with tiny trees and covered with gifts for the servants and the poor, stood on either side of the door. Dazzled by the light and the unfamiliar look of the room, they marched once around it, singing, filed past the manger where lay the little wax figure of the Christ child, and then moved to their places and stood silent. Hanno was quite dazed. His fevered glance had soon sought out the theatre, which, as it stood there upon the table, seemed larger and grander than anything he had dared to dream of. But his place had been changed. It was now opposite to where he had stood last year, and this made him doubtful whether the theatre was really his. And on the floor beneath it was something else, a large mysterious something, which had surely not been on his list, a piece of furniture that looked like a commode. Could it be meant for him? "Come here, my dear child," said the Frau Consul, "and look at this." She lifted the lid. "I know you like to play chorales. Herr Pfuhl will show you how. You must tread all the time, sometimes more and sometimes less, and then not lift up the hands, but change the fingers so, peu à peu." It was a harmonium, a pretty little thing of polished brown wood, with metal handles at the sides, gay bellows worked with a treadle, and a neat revolving stool. Hanno struck a chord. A soft organ tone released itself, and made the others look up from their presents. He hugged his grandmother, who pressed him tenderly to her, and then left him to receive the thanks of her other guests. He turned to his theatre. The harmonium was an overpowering dream, which just now he had no time to indulge. There was a superfluity of joy, and he lost sight of single gifts in trying to see and notice everything at once. Here was the prompter's box, a shell-shaped one, and a beautiful red and gold curtain rolled up and down behind it. The stage was set for the last act of Fidelio. The poor prisoner stood with folded hands. Don Pizarro, in enormous puffed sleeves, was striking a permanent and awesome attitude, and the minister in black velvet approached from behind with hasty strides to turn all to happiness. It was just as in the theatre, only almost more beautiful. The Jubilee chorus, the finale, echoed in Hanno's ears, and he sat down at the harmonium to play a fragment which stuck in his memory. But he got up again almost at once to take up the book he had wished for, a mythology in a red binding with a gold Pallas Athene on the cover. He ate some of the sweetmeats from his plate full of marzipan, gingerbread, and other goodies, looked through various small articles like writing utensils and school bag, and for the moment forgot everything else to examine a pen holder with a tiny glass bulb on it. When you held this up to your eye, you saw, like magic, a broad Swiss landscape. Mamselle Zéphirine and the maid passed tea and biscuits, and while Hanno dipped and ate, he had time to look about. Every one stood talking and laughing. They all showed each other their presents and admired the presents of others. Objects of porcelain, silver, gold, nickel, wood, silk, cloth, and every other conceivable material lay on the table. Huge loaves of decorated gingerbread, alternating with loaves of marzipan, stood in long rows, still moist and fresh. All the presents made by Frau Permanator were decorated with huge satin bows. Now and then some one came up to little Johann, put an arm across his shoulders, and looked at his presents with the overdone, cynical admiration which people manufacture for the treasures of children. Uncle Christian was the only person who did not display this grown-up arrogance. He sauntered over to his nephew's place, with a diamond ring on his finger, a present from his mother, and his pleasure in the toy theatre was as unaffected as Hanno's own. "By George, that's fine," he said, letting the curtain up and down and stepping back for a view of the scenery. "Did you ask for it? Oh, so you did ask for it," he suddenly said, after a pause, during which his eyes had roved about the room as though he were full of unquiet thoughts. "Why did you ask for it? What made you think of it? Have you been in the theatre?" "Fidelio, eh? Yes, they give that well. And you want to imitate it, do you? Do opera yourself, eh? Did it make such an impression on you? Listen, son, take my advice. Don't think too much about such things, theatre and that sort of thing. It's no good. Believe your old uncle. I've always spent too much time on them, and that is why I haven't come to much good. I've made great mistakes, you know." Thus he held forth to his nephew, while Hanno looked up at him curiously. He paused, and his bony, emaciated face cleared up as he regarded the little theatre. Then he suddenly moved forward one of the figures on the stage, and sang, in a cracked and hollow tremolo, "Ah, what terrible transgression!" He sat down on the piano stool, which he shoved up in front of the theatre, and began to give a performance, singing all the roles and the accompaniment as well, and gesticulating furiously. The family gathered at his back, laughed, nodded their heads, and enjoyed it immensely. As for Hanno, his pleasure was profound. Christian broke off after a while, very abruptly. His face clouded, he rubbed his hand over his skull and down his left side, and turned to his audience with his nose wrinkled and his face quite drawn. "There it is again," he said. "I never have a little fun without having to pay for it. It is not an ordinary pain, you know. It is a misery down all this left side, because the nerves are too short." But his relatives took his complaints as little seriously as they had his entertainment. They hardly answered him, but indifferently dispersed, leaving Christian sitting before the little theatre in silence. He blinked rapidly for a bit, and then got up. "No, child," said he, stroking Hanno's head. "Amuse yourself with it, but not too much, you know. Don't neglect your work for it. Do you hear? I have made a great many mistakes." "I think I'll go over to the club for a while," he said to the elders. "They are celebrating there to-day, too. Good-bye for the present." And he went off across the hall on his stiff, crooked legs. They had all eaten the midday meal earlier than usual to-day, and been hungry for the tea and biscuits. But they had scarcely finished when great crystal bowls were handed round, full of a yellow grainy substance which turned out to be almond cream. It was a mixture of eggs, ground almonds, and rose-water, tasting perfectly delicious, but if you ate even a tiny spoonful too much, the result was an attack of indigestion. However, the company was not restrained by fear of consequences, even though Frau Consul begged them to leave a little corner for supper. Clotilde, in particular, performed miracles with the almond cream, and lapped it up like so much porridge, with heartfelt gratitude. There was also wine jelly in glasses, and English plum cake. Gradually they all moved over to the landscape room, where they sat with their plates round the table. Hanno remained alone in the dining-room. Little Elizabeth Weinshank had already been taken home, but he was to stay up for supper, for the first time in his life. The servants and the poor folk had had their presents and gone. Ida Jungmann was chattering with Riekchen Severin in the hall, although generally, as a governess, she preserved the proper distance between herself and the Frau Consul's maid. The lights of the great tree were burnt down and extinguished. The manger was in darkness. But a few candles still burned on the small trees, and now and then a twig came within reach of the flame and crackled up, increasing the pungent smell in the room. Every breath of air that stirred the trees stirred the pieces of tinsel too, and made them give out a delicate metallic whisper. It was still enough to hear the hand-organ again sounding through the frosty air from a distant street. Hanno abandoned himself to the enjoyment of the Christmas sounds and smells. He propped his head on his hand and read in his mythology book, munching mechanically the while, because that was proper to the day. Marzipan, sweetmeats, almond cream, and plum cake, until the chest oppression caused by an overloaded stomach mingled with the sweet excitation of the evening, and gave him a feeling of pensive felicity. He read about the struggles of Zeus before he arrived at the headship of the gods, and every now and then he listened into the other room, where they were going at length into the future of poor Aunt Clotilde. Clotilde, on this evening, was far and away the happiest of them all. A smile lighted up her colourless face as she received congratulations and teasing from all sides. Her voice even broke now and then out of joyful emotion. She had at last been made a member of the Order of St. John. The senator had succeeded by subterranean methods in getting her admitted, not without some private grumblings about nepotism on the part of certain gentlemen. Now the family all discussed the excellent institution, which was similar to the homes in Mecklenburg, Dobertien, and Ribnitz, for ladies from noble families. The object of these establishments was the suitable care of portionless women from old and worthy families. Poor Clotilde was now assured of a small but certain income, which would increase with the years, and finally, when she had succeeded to the highest class, would secure her a decent home in the cloister itself. Little Hanno stopped a while with the grown-ups, but soon strayed back to the dining-room, which displayed a new charm, now that the brilliant light did not fairly dazzle one with its splendours. It was an extraordinary pleasure to roam about there, as if on a half-darkened stage after the performance, and see a little behind the scenes. He touched the lilies on the big fir tree with their golden stamens, handled the tiny figures of people and animals in the manger, found the candles that lighted the transparency for the Star of Bethlehem over the stable, lifted up the long cloth that covered the present table, and saw quantities of wrapping paper and pasteboard boxes stacked beneath. The conversation in the landscape room was growing less and less agreeable. Inevitably, irresistibly, it had arrived at the one dismal theme which had been in everybody's mind, but which they had thus far avoided as a tribute to the festal evening. Hugo Weinschenk himself dilated upon it with a wild levity of manner and gesture. He explained certain details of the procedure. The examination of witnesses had now been interrupted by the Christmas recess, condemned the very obvious bias of the president, Dr. Pelander, and poured scorn on the attitude which the public prosecutor, Dr. Hagenstrom, thought it proper to assume toward himself and the witnesses for the defense. Breslauer had succeeded in drawing the sting of several of his most slanderous remarks, and he had assured the director that for the present there need be no fear of a conviction. The senator threw in a question now and then out of courtesy, and Frau Permenater, sitting on the sofa with elevated shoulders, would utter fearful imprecations against Dr. Moritz Hagenstrom. But the others were silent. So profoundly silent that the director at length fell silent too. For little Hanno, over in the dining-room, the time sped by on angels' wings, but in the landscape-room there reigned an oppressive silence, which dragged on till Christian came back from the club, where he had celebrated Christmas with the bachelors and good fellows. The cold stump of a cigar hung between his lips, and his haggard cheeks were flushed. He came through the dining-room and said, as he entered the landscape-room, "Well, children, the tree was simply gorgeous. Weinschenk, we ought to have had Breslauer come to see it. He has never seen anything like it, I am sure." He encountered one of his mother's quiet, reproachful side glances, and returned it with an easy, unembarrassed, questioning look. At 9 o'clock the party sat down to supper. It was laid, as always on these occasions, in the pillared hall. The Frau Consul recited the ancient grace with sincere conviction. "Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest, and bless the bread thou gavest us." To which, as usual on the holy evening, she added a brief prayer, the substance of which was an admonition to remember those who on this blessed night did not fare so well as the Buddenbrook family. This accomplished, they all sat down with good consciences to a lengthy repast, beginning with carp and butter sauce and old Rhine wine. The senator put 2 fish scales into his pocket to help him save money during the coming year. Christian, however, ruefully remarked that he hadn't much faith in the prescription, and Consul Kruger had no need of it. His pittance had long since been invested securely beyond the reach of fluctuations in the exchange. The old man sat as far away as possible from his wife, to whom he hardly ever spoke nowadays. She persisted in sending money to Jacob, who was still roaming about nobody knew where, unless his mother did. Uncle Eustace scowled forbiddingly when the conversation, with the advent of the second course, turned upon the absent members of the family, and he saw the foolish mother wipe her eyes. They spoke of the Frankfurt Buddenbrooks, and the Duchamps in Hamburg, and of Pastor Tiburtius in Riga too, without any ill will. And the senator and his sister touched glasses in silence to the health of Messrs. Grunlich and Permenater, for, after all, did they not in a sense belong to the family too? The turkey, stuffed with chestnuts, raisins, and apples, was universally praised. They compared it with other years, and decided that this one was the largest for a long time. With the turkey came roast potatoes and 2 kinds of compote, and each dish held enough to satisfy the appetite of a family all by itself. The old red wine came from the firm of Mühlendorf. Little Johann sat between his parents and choked down with difficulty a small piece of white meat with stuffing. He could not begin to compete with Aunt Tilda, and he felt tired and out of sorts. But it was a great thing none the less to be dining with the grown-ups, and to have one of the beautiful little rolls with poppy seed in his elaborately folded serviette, and 3 wine-glasses in front of his place. He usually drank out of the little gold mug which Uncle Eustace gave him. But when the red, white, and brown meringues appeared, and Uncle Eustace poured some oily yellow Greek wine into the smallest of the 3 glasses, his appetite revived. He ate a whole red ice, then half a white one, then a little piece of the chocolate, his teeth hurting horribly all the while. Then he sipped his sweet wine gingerly, and listened to Uncle Christian, who had begun to talk. He told about the Christmas celebrations at the club, which had been very jolly, it seemed. "Good God!" he said, just as if he were about to relate the story of Johnny Thunderstorm. "Those fellows drank Swedish punch just like water." "Ugh!" said the Frau Consul shortly, and cast down her eyes. But he paid no heed. His eyes began to wander, and thought and memory became so vivid that they flickered like shadows across his haggard face. "Do any of you know," he asked, "how it feels to drink too much Swedish punch? I don't mean getting drunk. I mean the feeling you have the next day, the after-effects. They are very queer and unpleasant. Yes, queer and unpleasant at the same time." "Reason enough for describing them," said the senator. "Say, Christian, that does not interest us in the least," said the Frau Consul, but he paid no attention. It was his peculiarity that at such times nothing made any impression on him. He was silent a while, and then it seemed that the thing which moved him was ripe for speech. "You go about feeling ghastly," he said, turning to his brother and wrinkling up his nose. "Headache and upset stomach. Oh, well, you have that with other things too, but you feel filthy." Here he rubbed his hands together, his face entirely distorted. "You wash your hands, but it does no good. They feel dirty and clammy, and there is grease under the nails. You take a bath, no good, your whole body is sticky and unclean. You itch all over, and you feel disgusted with yourself. Do you know the feeling, Thomas? You do know it, don't you?" "Yes, yes," said the senator, making a gesture of repulsion with his hand. But Christian's extraordinary tactlessness had so increased with the years that he never perceived how unpleasant he was making himself to the company, nor how out of place his conversation was in these surroundings and on this evening. He continued to describe the evil effects of too much Swedish punch, and when he felt that he had exhausted the subject, he gradually subsided. Before they arrived at the butter and cheese, the Frau Consul found occasion for another little speech to her family. "If," she said, "not quite everything in the course of the years had gone as we, in our short-sightedness, desired, there remained such manifold blessings as should fill our hearts with gratitude and love. For it was precisely this mingling of trials with blessings which showed that God never lifted his hand from the family, but ever guided its destinies according to his wise design, which we might not seek to question. And now, with hopeful hearts, we might drink together to the family health and to its future, that future when all the old and elderly of the present company would be laid to rest, and to the children, to whom the Christmas feast most properly belonged. As Director Weinschenk's small daughter was no longer present, little Johann had to make the round of the table alone, and drink severally with all the company, from grandmamma to Mamselle Severin. When he came to his father, the senator touched the child's glass with his, and gently lifted Hanno's chin to look into his eyes. But his son did not meet his glance. The long gold-brown lashes lay deep, deep upon the delicate bluish shadows beneath his eyes. Teresa Weichbrot took his head in both her hands, kissed him explosively on both cheeks, and said with such a hearty emphasis that surely God must have heeded it, "Be happy, you good child." An hour later Hanno lay in his little bed, which now stood in the antechamber next to the senator's dressing-room. He lay on his back, out of regard for his stomach, which feeling was far from pleasant over all the things he had put into it that evening. Ida came out of her room in her dressing-gown, waving a glass about in circles in the air in order to dissolve its contents. He drank the carbonate of soda down quickly, made a wry face, and fell back again. "I think I'll just have to give it all up, Ida," he said. "Oh, nonsense, Hanno. Just lie still on your back. You see now, who was it kept making signs at you to stop eating, and who was it that wouldn't do it?" "Well, perhaps I'll be all right. When will the things come, Ida?" "Tomorrow morning, first thing, my dearie." "I wish they were here. I wish I had them now." "Yes, yes, my dearie, but just have a good sleep now." She kissed him, put out the light, and went away. He lay quietly, giving himself up to the operation of the soda he had taken. But before his eyes gleamed the dazzling brilliance of the Christmas tree. He saw his theatre and his harmonium and his book of mythology. He heard the choir boys singing in the distance, "Rejoice, Jerusalem." Everything sparkled and glittered. His head felt dull and feverish. His heart, affected by the rebellious stomach, beat strong and irregularly. He lay for long in a condition of mingled discomfort, excitement, and reminiscent bliss, and could not fall asleep. Next day there would be a third Christmas party at Fräulein Weichbrot's. He looked forward to it as to a comic performance in the theatre. Teresa Weichbrot had given up her pensionnat in the past year. Madame Kettelson now occupied the first story of the house on the mill bank, and she herself the ground floor, and there they lived alone. The burden of her deformed little body grew heavier with the years, and she concluded, with Christian humility and submission, that the end was not far off. For some years now she had believed that each Christmas was her last, and she strove with all the powers at her command to give a departing brilliance to the feast that was held in her small overheated rooms. Her means were very narrow, and she gave away each year a part of her possessions to swell the heap of gifts under the tree. Knick-knacks, paper-weights, emery bags, needle-cushions, glass vases, and fragments of her library, miscellaneous books of every shape and size, books like The Secret Journal of a Student of Himself, Hebel's Alemannian Poems, Krummacher's Parables. Hanno had once received an edition of the Pensées de Blaise Pascal in such tiny print that it had to be read with the glass. Bishop flowed in streams, and Sesame's gingerbread was very spicy. But Fräulein Weichbrot abandoned herself with such trembling emotion to the joys of each Christmas party, that none of them ever went off without a mishap. There was always some small catastrophe or other to make the guests laugh and enhance the silent fervor of the hostess's mien. A jug of bishop would be upset and overwhelm everything in a spicy, sticky red flood, or the decorated tree would topple off its wooden support just as they solemnly entered the room. Hanno fell asleep with the mishap of the previous year before his eyes. It had happened just before the gifts were given out. Teresa Weichbrot had read the Christmas chapter in such impressive accents that all the vowels got inextricably commingled, and then retreated before her guests to the door, where she made a little speech. She stood before the threshold, humped and tiny, her old hands clasped before her childish bosom, the green silk cap ribbons falling over her fragile shoulders. Above her head, over the door, was a transparency, garlanded with evergreen, that said, "Glory to God in the highest." And Sesame spoke of God's mercy. She mentioned that this was her last Christmas, and ended by reminding them that the words of the apostle commended them all to joy, wherewith she trembled from head to foot, so much did her whole poor little body share in her emotions. "Rejoice," said she, laying her head on one side and nodding violently, "and again I say unto you, rejoice." But at this moment the whole transparency, with a puffing, crackling, spitting noise, went up in flames, and Mademoiselle Weichbrot gave a little shriek and a side spring of unexpected picturesqueness and agility, and got herself out of the way of the rain of flying sparks. As Hanno recalled the leap which the old spinster performed, he giggled nervously for several minutes into his pillow. End of section 80.